morning and welcome. Wonderful to see you all here today. This is the history of the Geelong Queenscliffe Railway. At the museum we have many amazing people as volunteers, and one of those is Paul Attwood. Paul was a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Western Australia till 2020 when he moved to Geelong. He did a lot of research while he was at the university and wrote over 100 articles. Luckily for us, Paul became a volunteer at the museum, primarily in research, and has been using his experience and skills to carry out research requested both by members as well as original research. And many of you will have been here last year to hear his research on the horse racing in Queenscliffe. Today we're here to hear his research onto the Geelong Queenscliffe Railway. And I'd like you all to give Paul a warm welcome. Thank you.
So thanks, Mary Lou, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming today. So if you came expecting to hear details of types of steam engine and gauges of track and signalling layouts, I'm afraid you're going to be a bit disappointed. My focus has been to really assemble an overview of why the railway was built, and how it operated in general terms, but based on mainly contemporary accounts, primarily in newspapers. So before we get on to the railway itself, I want to just talk briefly about what transportation there was between Queenscliffe and Geelong before the railway came. So obviously there was a road of sorts, as we'll see, and the forms of transportation were on horseback, by coach, so there was a mail coach operating, and for goods there were wagons to take goods between Queenscliffe and Geelong. There were also ships plied between Melbourne and Geelong and Queenscliffe. The early form of shipping would have been sailing ships, but latterly paddle steamers became a major form of transportation. So if we look at road transport first, the first photograph at the top here is a photograph of the part of the Geelong to Queenscliffe road at Queenscliffe in 1906. And as you can see, it doesn't look much like a modern road. It's sort of metalled, but not particularly robustly, I think. Here we have a photograph from our collection which shows a wagon at Queenscliffe piled high with possibly wheat or barley or something like that, I guess. Here we have the Cobb & Co. Queenscliffe Geelong mail coach. This was taken in 1864. And the mail coach was important because the mails from Europe came in at Queenscliffe and then were transported up to Geelong and then to Melbourne. So the movement of mails was an important part of transportation between Queenscliffe and Geelong. Now the road, however, as I've hinted at, was not the best road. And in 1853, there was an article, a letter to the Argus, which said, while thousands and hundreds of thousands of pounds was being expended on bridges and miles upon miles of road in other parts of the colony, while tens of thousands of pounds are drawn from us monthly from the sale of land, we are insulted to the teeth by the offer of making half a mile of a road that's 30 miles in length. So there was some public feeling about this road. And in 1860, there was this article which said, in the Argus, which said, remarked on the fact that a culvert was built at Fenwick's Gully. Now, Fenwick's Gully, as far as I can tell, is at the bottom of the hill where the Adventure Park is. So, and that often used to flood. So it says that there was a culvert built, but then work was stopped, leaving the road utterly impractical for vehicles of any kind. So this, we've gone from 1853, complaints about the road, 1860, complaint about the road, 1871, and I won't read it all, but it just said, it's a complaint about the road, and it says we may term the road the track. So obviously not a very passable road. And in 1928, there's still complaints about the road. And I suppose if you look in the newspapers today, there are probably complaints of some sort. But again, the complaint was about the disgraceful condition of a section of the road. So the road wasn't that good very often. I mean, it was probably okay in the summer, but if you had a fair amount of rain in the winter, it would become impassable in places. So apart from the state of the road transportation was costly. So when the road was passable, there was a daily Royal Mail coach service between Geelong and Queenscliffe, starting from Geelong at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and returning from Queenscliffe the following day at 8:30. And the journey took about 3 hours between Geelong and Queenscliffe. And the fare for that, if you're a passenger on it, was 10 shillings. Now, I've used this website which kind of translates what money in a period of history was compared to more or less current day, and that is equivalent to $44 in today's money if you only take into account inflation. If you take into account what 10 shillings was as a proportion of the average wage in 1859, then that translates to $600 in today's terms. So it wasn't cheap. And in fact, I found this report at this website, and it says, it is reported that the transport of one farmer's produce 25 miles by road to Melbourne cost as much as shipping the same produce from Liverpool, England to Melbourne. So, that points out just how expensive the movement of goods was at that time. So let's move on to water transport, and I've just more or less as decoration, I guess, put a couple of pictures from our collection. No, actually not from our collection, it's from our website. A picture of a paddle steamer Williams in 1873 and the Ozone in 1886. One advantage of water transport was that it was faster and cheaper than by road. But unfortunately, the service provided was not very frequent. And for example, in the late 1840s and 1850s, the paddle steamer Vesta sailed from Melbourne to Queenscliffe on Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays. So there was a service, and it was cheaper than road, but not that frequent. And the cost of passage from Melbourne to Queenscliffe was 10 shillings. So if you remember, the coach fare from Geelong to Queenscliffe was 10 shillings. On the paddle steamer, it was 10 shillings from Melbourne to Queenscliffe. So obviously a bit cheaper. So the question that I came across when I first started doing this research was, well, why build a railway? Well, from what I've said about the forms of transportation between Queenscliffe and Geelong that existed before the railway, you can see that they were rather inadequate. in terms of either difficulties with the road, infrequency of water transport, and so on. Another important factor, however, that was used to promote the building of the railway was the defence of Port Phillip and the fear of invasion. Well, when I saw that, I thought, well, who's going to invade Port Phillip? But there was a real fear. So the first that I saw was the Russians. I thought, come on, why are people worried about the Russians invading Melbourne? I mean, it just seemed crazy. But there was a real difficulty partly because Britain had been at war with Russia in the Crimea, allied to Turkey and France, I might add. So that was one factor. The other was there was a constant worry about Russia encroaching on India, sometimes through Afghanistan. So there was always this concern that Russia, being a big country, could in fact declare war at some time. And we had to worry about possible invasion by the Russians. So that was an interesting surprise to me. I hadn't thought of that. The Americans, well, these days we don't think about the Americans invading us, but you have to remember that this was at the time of the Civil War in America, and Britain came awfully close to recognising the Confederate States. So there was this kind of concern that the United States of America would have perhaps some grudge against Britain for that support of the Confederate States. And finally, the French. Well, we don't need any special reason to worry about the French. Don't forget that only 40 years before the 1850s, Britain had been at war with France in the Napoleonic Wars. It had only been 50 years since the French crown renounced its claim to the French crown. So the English crown renounced its claim to the French crown. And it was 50 years before the Entente Cordiale was signed between Britain and France. So there was this worry about the French. And this was actually made worse by the takeover of New Caledonia by the French in this 1850 period. And they established a naval base in New Caledonia. So there was that concern as well. So the defence of Port Phillip was a factor in the building of the railway. So in 1860, a captain, Sir Peter Scratchley, wrote a report on the defences of Melbourne and Geelong, and he recommended that a railway be built from Geelong to Queenscliffe to allow rapid reinforcement of the defences at Queenscliffe. And later, in 1877, there was another survey of the defences of both Australia and New Zealand by Scratchley again, but also in collaboration with Drummond Jervois. And this resulted in the building of extensive fortifications to defend Port Phillip, and this included the Fort Queenscliff. Okay, so let's move on now to look in general at the building and operating of railways in the mid-19th century. So the Melbourne to Geelong railway line was built by the Geelong and Melbourne Railway Company in 1857. And this engraving over here shows the gala opening of that railway line between Melbourne and Geelong. So the building of that line then opened up the possibility of extensions of the railway to both Queenscliffe and Colac and going westwards towards Hamilton. Now, I found this piece in the Geelong Advertiser in 1864, which, as we go through my talk, you'll see is a bit prescient. And I'll read it because I think it's important that this problem with railways was being recognised early on. It is certain that the railways will not pay their working expenses, much less contribute anything towards paying the interest on the loan that was taken to build them, and it's very evident that taxation rendered inevitable by the necessity of making provision for this liability will fall as heavily on the travellers on the railway and travellers on common roads. Okay, so this piece indicates there was grave doubt that railways would ever pay their way. So let's see how that turned out. So in terms of the building of the railway between Queenscliffe and Geelong, in the 1860s there was not much government enthusiasm and certainly no money available. The Queenscliffe Borough Council was really active in promoting the building of the railway, and they went to Geelong, a deputation went to Geelong and spoke to the mayors and councillors from Geelong and the surrounding areas and got them on side to promote the building of the railway. And a deputation of these people met the Chief Secretary, James McCulloch, to lobby for the railway in 1866 and asked for a government survey of the line to be undertaken. McCulloch's reply was that if such a survey were undertaken, it would not have to be construed as a promise to carry out the line. So they might survey the line, but they wouldn't promise to build it. But he added he didn't think there was any money available. In 1867, the Minister of Railways stated there was no money left over from the survey of the Geelong to Colac line, so that line was surveyed quite quickly, but there was no money left over for the survey of the Queenscliffe line. And he had not at present a sixpence to expend on that purpose. So now we turn to another body that lobbied for the building of the railways, and that was the Western Railway Extension League. Now these railway extension leagues were quite common in this era in Victoria, and they were public bodies formed to agitate for the expansion of the Victorian railway system. One early example was the North Eastern Railway Extension League, which was promoting the construction of a railway to the Ovens and Murray districts. The Western Railway Extension League was formed in 1867, and its initial purpose was to promote the extension of the railway to Hamilton, so a long way west. But later actually became involved in promoting the building of the railway to Queenscliffe. So the first step of the westward expansion of the railway system was the line from Geelong to Colac. So that was going to be built first. Two routes were proposed, and they were called the Black Line and the Green Line. I've drawn on this map, so this is Geelong here, this is Corio Bay. And I've drawn this line here, and it doesn't really wobble around like that. It's just my fingers not that good at drawing lines. But the green line, the idea was the green line would use an existing part of the track between Geelong and Ballarat, and then branch off from that north of Geelong and head towards Inverleigh, and then eventually down to Colac. So that was the green line. And then the black line is at the bottom here. And I was intrigued to hear that initially it was proposed that this line would head from Geelong Station down to Corio Bay, go along the bay, and then cut across the hill near to Limeburners Point, and then go back down towards the river here. Now, of course, that's not the line that was built. The line that was built, as you probably know if you've ever been on the Geelong line, the line that was built went from the railway station through a tunnel under the hill that comes after Geelong railway station, heads towards McKillop Street and that way, towards South Geelong station, and then follows the route of the current Colac line towards Colac. Now, the first sod that was turned for the Geelong to Colac Railway occurred in 1864, and this was undertaken by the mayor at Geelong Station. Now, the advantage of the Black Line for proponents of the railway line between Geelong and Queenscliffe was that part of this line to South Geelong could be used as part of the Geelong to Queenscliffe connection. And so it would only be necessary to build the line from more or less South Geelong down to Queenscliffe. Whereas the Green Line was really way out of range in terms of providing any benefit to the building of the Queenscliffe line. So I've drawn on the map here again, but this is more or less the route of the line that occurs now from South Geelong, well, Geelong Station, through South Geelong, through Moolap, Leopold, and then originally the line was planned to go more or less directly to Queenscliffe, but there was a lot of political agitation by the residents of Drysdale. And so there was a 3-mile deviation put into the line to take it via Drysdale. Now, there was a practical reason for doing this as well. There was actually an easy water supply at Drysdale to re-water the steam engines. So there was some practical reason for doing this. And of course, the Drysdale acted as a hub for produce coming in from the Bellarine to be put onto the train. And then it continued to Queenscliffe. So a railways bill was adopted in 1876 to 1877. It was actually interrupted by an election, so yeah, it took longer than it should have. But it was adopted and provided for the construction of 300 miles of railway, and this included the line to Queenscliffe. So in 1878 there were calls for tenders to build the railway, but this didn't include the railway stations, and there was a clause in the tendering process that the preparation work for the first quarter mile of the track was to be undertaken by day labourers to provide work for the unemployed of Geelong. So that was quite nice to put that clause into that tender, I think. And in August 1878, the tender of £58,977, 7 shillings and sixpence was put in and was successful by Messrs. Topham, Angus and Smith. And that, just to give you a feeling, is equivalent to £8,172,000 today. Dollars, sorry, I'm English, so I'm thinking in pounds. Dollars. So the length of the line from South Geelong, because remember the Geelong to South Geelong line was part of the Colac line that had already been built, was 34.2 kilometres, and if you do the maths, that works out at $239,000 per kilometre in current money terms. And I tried to find a comparison, and the only one that I could easily find was the cost of the Alice Springs to Darwin Railway, which was $1,056,000 per kilometre in 2003. Now, you know, that sounds like there's a huge difference, but I guess we have to be a little careful because of the the problems in building a railway in remote Australia. Remember, this line to Queenscliffe was through fairly well-established countryside. It wasn't a big issue. So, you know, it was probably a bit cheaper. So construction began on the 27th of August 1878 both at Geelong, at South Geelong and at Queenscliffe. So they were starting from both ends, working towards the middle. And by early September, work was well underway, with 50 men employed on cuttings near Queenscliffe. But there was a general complaint of lack of the right class of navvy offering for employment. Half of the men are not fit for work. And below, an even more condemnatory quote, a very large number of men living in distant parts of the colony have visited the works for employment, but many of them, after handling a pick and shovel for a few hours, have thrown up the work and swagged it off to some more congenial occupation. So labour was an issue, even though apparently, as we saw earlier, there was a fair amount of unemployment around. One of the last parts of the railway to be built was the station at Queenscliffe. And as we heard in a talk about, I think a month ago or so, about the dwellers of Fisherman's Flat, this delay in building the station at Queenscliffe was at least in part due to the need to displace a number of the cottages of these fishermen. And so the last rail was laid on the 3rd of May, 1879, and yeah, this is amazing. On time and on budget. I mean, when have you seen that? Any time recently? Okay, so here are some engravings from the Illustrated Australian News showing the opening of the railway on the 21st of May 1879, showing the arrival of the governor at Queenscliffe. And you'll notice there's an arch, a celebratory arch built in the background there. And I think that was the arch that the fishermen actually did a lot of work on. Then there was a banquet at Adman's Hotel. So there were big celebrations. So let's have a look at the early days of the operation of the railway. So initially, the only intermediate station on the line was at Drysdale, but by 1883 there were stations at Kensington Flats, Leopold, Moolap, Ocean Grove, later renamed Marcus, and Marcus Hill, later renamed Mannering. So there was a proliferation of stations on the line, and this was mainly due to lobbying of residents at those places to get a station. Now that it struck me as a bit odd, and maybe someone could tell me why this was the case. The tunnel that those of you who've been on that line that occurs immediately after Geelong Station and goes under, well, let's see, I suppose it's under Myers Street and there coming out at McKillop Street, was apparently something of a novelty. Even in 1882, so this is 3 years after the railway was built, and this article was in the Ballarat Courier, and it said, that dreadful tunnel, the young ladies were in dread terror at the thought of having to spend 3 minutes in total darkness. And now as we entered that dreadful place, up with the windows, and then screams intermingled with peals of laughter came from almost every carriage, whilst matches were lit and as quickly blown out by the mischievous. So perhaps someone can tell me at the end whether tunnels were not that common in railways in Victoria. So initially, there was only one service per day in each direction, and initially, surprisingly, only first-class carriages were provided. But by 1885, there were 4 services per day in each direction, and both first and second class carriages were provided. Now, 1885 was in fact the apogee of the frequency of passenger service on the railway. From there on in, it tended to go down. So only 6 years after it opened, it reached its peak and then gradually started to decline. And here's a picture which is not particularly clear of a train in 1895 at Queenscliffe station. And again, this comes from the QHM collection. And you can see the railway carriages, the passenger carriages there, with possibly a freight car at the back. So the full fare from Melbourne to Queenscliffe was 23 shillings return. And that sounds a lot when you bear in mind those translations I've been giving you into current money. But in fact, there were a lot, you could get an excursion fare that was a lot cheaper. So you could go from Melbourne to Queenscliffe return for 7 and 6pence. That's leaving on Saturday, going down to Queenscliffe on Saturday and returning on Monday. Now, excursions themselves were very popular. So excursions by rail to Queenscliffe were very popular. And one of the first of these was that of a state school in Collingwood. And pupils were given the choice between visiting the juvenile exhibition in Geelong, which I'm sure was very educational, or a day in Queenscliffe. Perhaps not surprisingly, it was unanimous in favour of Queenscliffe. And 2 special trains departed Melbourne carrying 1,200 parents, children and teachers. A report on the festivities in Queenscliffe noted with pleasant surprise that none of the rowdyism of Collingwood was on display. So I'm guessing that this has something connected to Collingwood football team, but I could be wrong. Now, one group that made these excursions for many years was the Ballarat Orphanage, and they had annual excursions from 1895 to 1934. So that showed a remarkable commitment to giving those kids an outing to the seaside. Now, interestingly, any spare capacity on these excursion trains was in fact sold to the public. So you could get on one of these trains if you wanted with 1,200 pupils from Collingwood, if there was any space. I'll leave for you to decide whether you do that. So perhaps the most important day for excursions to Queenscliffe was the arrival of the Great White Fleet in 1908. And this is a picture of part of the fleet arriving. And this Great White Fleet was the American fleet. And one of the busiest days for special excursion trains to Queenscliffe came on the 29th of August 1908, when the American fleet entered Port Phillip, and special trains departed from Geelong every 15 minutes between 6 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. Think how many trains that was. It's huge. So, of course, now we come to military uses, because remember, one of the reasons for building this railway was its use for reinforcing defences at Queenscliffe. Now, unfortunately, or perhaps very fortunately, the railway never had to be employed in that respect. It never had to transport reinforcements to repel an invasion. But nonetheless, the railway was important in transporting military personnel. And there were 2 times of the year that were especially important. One at Easter, where there were manoeuvres held near Queenscliffe, and one later in the year for artillery practice, using the guns at Fort Queenscliffe and the other forts in the Bay area. In 1882, however, the railway authorities stated it was beyond their resources to transport the artillerymen to Queenscliffe to practice. Now, this is only 3 years after the railway had been built, one of the prime reasons being the transportation of military personnel to Queenscliffe. So that's kind of worrying. Now, during both World Wars, Queenscliffe was a hive of military activity. There were camps, and this picture here from our collection shows army recruits marching up from the railway station to a camp on the sports oval in 1940. All right, so there was a lot of transportation of military personnel. Now, interestingly, and I had to put this in because it struck me as a bit bizarre, it was used to transport shirkers. Now, these aren't shirkers in the sense of enlisted military people being transported, but they were in fact boys. So from 1911 to 1929, boys are involved in the Universal Service Scheme. 12 to 14-year-olds were junior cadets, and 14 to 18-year-olds were senior cadets. Boys who shirked military drill, were called shirkers, were sentenced to detention at military barracks and forts. So there was an example here in 1914 of a boy named Ryan who was sentenced to 21 days detention at Queenscliffe for having failed to put time into drill. So they took this lad, he went through before a sort of military court, was sentenced, put on the train to Queenscliffe, and then detained at the fort for 21 days. I just thought that was amazing. How could that happen, and why didn't I know about it? Probably some of you do know about it, but it just struck me as interesting. All right, so let's have a look at the running of the railways, but this is really from the perspective of people who use the railways. And there were complaints about passenger accommodation on the Queenscliffe line through a large part of its life. And so the Queenscliffe Sentinel in 1882 reported complaints about the use of cattle trucks for passenger accommodation on the trains to Queenscliffe. In 1883, on the main lines you ride in new well-cushioned carriages, and when you get on the branch country lines you realise where the old carriages go to. We did not mind so much as to their being old, but the stained, dirty condition of their seats and upholstery gave one a very uncomfortable feeling as you sat down, which it required a degree of resolution to overcome. In 1901, of the passenger carriages, they are old and uncomfortable goes without saying, but when the big B flat, now I'm not sure about this, but I think that's some kind of bed bug, has made its home in the stuffing of the almost rotten cushions, it's time to protest. And in 1907, in the Geelong Advertiser, most of the carriages which comprised the train were veritable dog boxes. So passengers generally weren't too happy about the accommodation. In terms of freight carried by the line, well, of course, the mails were carried from inbound ships at Queenscliffe. Fresh fish was a major freight carried by the railway from the fishing fleet. This occurred up to the 1930s. Agricultural produce from the Bellarine Peninsula, largely from Drysdale and around Drysdale, and the intermediate stations. Salt was a big commodity, and this was transported from Cheetham salt pans on Corio Bay east of Geelong from 1909 to 1978. And shell grit at Lakers Siding, which is not that far from Queenscliffe, was carried from 1959 to 1973. And for those of you who don't know what shell grit's used for, and I didn't, Most of the shell grit went to the Australian Glass Company at Spotswood, so I assume it's used in the making of glass somehow. And the picture here shows the last train loaded with shell grit at Lakers Siding. And that's from our collection as well. Okay, so now we move on to the decline of the railway. So in about 1915, the first bus services between Geelong and Queenscliffe were introduced. Then in 1927, the railway department started running bus services between Geelong and Queenscliffe, and this was in competition with the private bus services. And this prompted the somewhat pointed comment, is it not their business to run trains and not buses? Well, good point. By October 1927, the rail service comprised 2 mixed trains, that's goods and passenger, per day on the line, plus 2 return motor coach services per day, with 3 on Saturdays. And here's a picture from our collection of one of the early buses used in a private bus service, and this is from 1928. So in 1931, the chairman of the Railway Commissioners, Mr. Clapp, firmly put the blame for any closure of passenger services on the Queenscliffe community. He pointed out that Queenscliffe residents patronised private enterprise, and that's the bus services provided by private enterprise, in preference to the railway. And the school children of residents of Queenscliffe obtained special concession rates for train travel, while their parents travelled by private bus. Fishermen were given low freight rates to transport their catch to market, yet their wives travelled by private enterprise. So he was saying, it's your fault, you residents of Queenscliffe. So on May the 29th, 1931, Mr. Clapp formally announced that owing to declining passenger traffic on the line, and towards the end of 1930 and the beginning of 1931, there were only 22 passengers per day on the line, the service would be cancelled from the 1st of June. And on the 2nd of June, The Age reported that a fleet of private sedan cars ran a regular service between Queenscliffe and Geelong throughout the day in response to withdrawal of the railway passenger service. Now, I think that's interesting because it points to 2 factors. One, that there was a fair degree of altruism, I think, in the residents of Geelong and Queenscliffe in terms of providing that service, but also that this is probably looking at the growth of car ownership, which of course led, in part at least, to the demise of the railway. Regular passenger services ceased, but this letter writer noted that instead of meeting competition with an improved service and lower railway fares, the railway commissioners withdrew the service, whilst other pampered places still added to the deficit. So there was a feeling that the people of Queenscliffe were being hard done by the railway commissioners. So as I said, regular passenger services ceased in 1932. Passengers could still have a travel on infrequent goods services, and excursion trains were still run frequently, up indeed until the final closure of the line in 1976. And these excursion trains were particularly used at Christmas and Easter for the holidays. In 1934, goods services were reduced 2 per week, and then in 1954 to 1 per week. And then in 1976, on the 6th of November, the line was closed completely. So then, if a line is closed, the question is the line, are the sleepers and the rails ripped up and removed, or are they left? Well, unfortunately for us, that wasn't the end of the story of the Queenscliffe Railway. In 1970, the Geelong Steam Preservation Society lobbied politicians to preserve the assets of the Queenscliffe line with a view to establishing a tourist railway. And obviously they were successful in that endeavour. And in 1979, passenger trains ran between Queenscliffe and Lakers Siding. And in 1980, the track as far as Drysdale was refurbished. And now, under the auspices of the Bellarine Railway, there are regular trains run between Queenscliffe and Drysdale. In addition to that, there's the Q train, which is the restaurant train that runs between Queenscliffe and Drysdale. And there's the blues train as well, which is a mobile concert, basically, run on the railway. And this is a picture of a Bellarine Railway train running by Swan Bay in the early 2000s, again from our collection. So on that happier note, I will end, but before I do that, I'd just like to give some acknowledgements. My thanks to Diana Sawyer for encouraging me to do this project and for reading the finished manuscript, and there are some booklets that I've written, if you are interested, for sale by the museum. My thanks also to Marilyn Miller for reading her reading and correction of the research manuscript. Thanks to other members of the QHM research team, because as I've done the research, I've talked to various members of the research team and other members of the museum who offered some insights and suggestions, which I'm very grateful for. And lastly, it would have been very difficult to both write the booklet and present this talk without referring to this book, Trains, Troops and Tourists, published in 2004 by Paul and Kathleen Kenny. This is a really invaluable source of detailed information about the railway, and especially useful for the latter years of the railway and the formation of the Bellarine Railway. So thank you very much for your attention.